Good afternoon. It's 4 o'clock. Welcome to the second Panorama event. My name is Dr. Joseph Camo. I'm an assistant professor of sociology here at Georgia Southwestern State University. I'm the chair of the Panorama Planning Committee, and I will be serving as the moderator for today's event. During the first event, we discussed free and responsible speech. Free speech and freedom of expression are cornerstones of our values as a society. But even with free speech and when we exercise it, there are questions that remain. Is anyone listening? Does my voice matter? In today's Panorama, we're going to discuss these topics from a number of different perspectives. So I'd like to begin by introducing our panelists, and then I will discuss a few procedural aspects of the event, and then we will begin. In alphabetical order, our first panelist is Dr. Jason Bergen. Dr. Bergen has been an assistant professor of political science at Georgia Southwestern State University since 2009. Prior to that, he taught 2 years at the University of Georgia. He received his doctorate in 2007 from Florida International University in Miami, and his topic is Voting, It's Your Right and Responsibility. Laura Lee Bernstein. Ms. Bernstein is the former Chief Administrative Officer for the City of Americus. She will be discussing the importance of having a voice in local politics. Tanya Hughes. Ms. Hughes is a senior lecturer of visual arts at GSW and is also actively involved in the Women's Studies program. She will be discussing marginalized voices. Dr. Philip Smedra. Dr. Smedra is a professor of economics at GSW and has personal experience as an activist. Dr. Smedra will be discussing activism as an expression of your voice. Each panelist has been asked to prepare a 7-minute opening remark on their area of expertise. And when they reach 7 minutes, I will say time, but they will have 30 seconds to continue and finalize their current point. Once all panelists have made their opening remarks, we'll transition to the question and answer portion of the discussion. During the Q&A, panelists will respond to questions from the audience. As the moderator, my role will be to distribute the questions, but I will not be responding to the questions myself. For the Q&A portion, we have set up 2 microphone stations, one over here and one over here. We'd ask that you line up at the stations if you have a question. If for some reason you are physically not able to go to a station, please raise your hand. We have 2 mic attendants who will make arrangements to bring a microphone to you. In the interest of time, we'd like to ask that you limit your questions and comments to about 1 minute in duration. And we would also like to ask that when you step up to the microphone, that you begin by introducing yourself. And if you're a student, please identify your major. If you are a faculty member, staff member, or member of the community, please identify yourself by name and your professional title. In addition to the Q&A, we will be live tweeting during the event with quotes and comments using the Twitter handle @Panorama_GSW. And we encourage you to be a part of the discussion on Twitter. Finally, the event is being recorded and will be posted to the GSW YouTube page. So without further ado, let's begin with our first panelist, Dr. Jason Bergen.
Our founders believed that if this noble view of the rights of man was to flourish, it must be rooted in democracy. The most basic right of all was the right to choose your own leaders. The history of this country, in large measure, is the history of the expansion of that right to all of our people. Lyndon Johnson, March 15th, 1965. Afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Joseph, for organizing this event. This spring is the 50th anniversary of the Selma March to Montgomery. People may remember the violence associated with the march on Bloody Sunday. The state police attacking approximately 600 marchers on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. But what was the purpose of that march? The purpose was about voting. Even though it was a majority-minority city, at the time in 1965, only about 1%, 2% of the blacks in Selma were registered to vote. The march to Montgomery was a dramatic means to assert a basic constitutional human right in the face of racial violence and intimidation, determined to prevent the voter registration campaign. As President Lyndon Johnson explained in his statement of support on March 9th, 1965, the occasion of the march was to promote the right of Alabama citizens to walk from Selma to Montgomery in order to focus attention on their efforts to secure the right to register and vote. It was, he said, an expression of the unending search for American freedom. Johnson subsequently requested that the Congress pass a comprehensive voting rights bill. By August, the landmark Voting Rights Act was passed. Voting, therefore, is a way for us to honor the great civil rights movements of the past, the campaigns to eliminate barriers of race, color, and previous conditions of servitude, as in the 15th Amendment, gender in the 19th. The 23rd gave the District of Columbia voting rights in the Electoral College. The 24th Amendment eliminated the poll tax. The 26th Amendment lowered the voting age to 18. Voting is also one key and vital expression of our citizenship. It is our right and responsibility to exercise it. Voting is a way for us to express our support or opposition to candidates, parties, and policies. It is a way to officially register our opinion. It is a way to hold those elected accountable for their actions and decisions, or the lack thereof. Can we ask members of Congress, ask members of the General Assembly to do their jobs if we don't do ours? Unfortunately, and I'm tailoring this to obviously a college community, but unfortunately voters 18 to 29 have the lowest and most inconsistent voting participation in the United States. Consider the 2012 presidential election. And of course, presidential elections do have higher voter turnout than the midterm congressional elections. In 2012, the overall voter turnout was 59%. That means that 59% of the voter-eligible population came out and voted. In terms of our states, figures varied from a high of 76% in Minnesota to a low of 44.5% in Hawaii. Georgia was right at the national average in 2012. By age, there were dramatic differences. According to a study from Tufts University in 2012, only about 45% of voters 18 to 29 participated. However, 72% of those 65 and older did, and 68% of those between 45 and 64% participated. Why does this matter? It matters in terms of the issues that may be prioritized. Issues that may matter more to older Americans may figure more than issues that matter to younger Americans. In other words, if you want politicians to give greater attention, let's say, to education, voters 18 to 29 need to vote in equivalent rates to other groups. It matters in terms of which candidates and which party wins. As an example, and to illustrate the point, younger voters are more likely to vote Democratic. In 2012, 60% of voters 18 to 29 voted for Barack Obama. In contrast, 56% of voters 65 and older, and again, they had participated at a higher rate, whereas 56% of voters 65 and older preferred Mitt Romney. In other words, stark differences by age. In 2014, younger voters preferred Democratic congressional candidates by 11 points. Those 65 and older preferred Republican candidates by 16, and we know the outcomes in 2014. Again, stark difference. It matters in terms of which ballot measures may pass. Younger voters compared to older voters tend to be more progressive and/or libertarian in their social outlook. For instance, in Florida this past election, voters considered whether or not to approve a measure to legalize marijuana for medicinal purposes. Overall in this state, voters supported it 58 to 42. However, in Florida, there is a threshold requirement of 60%, a supermajority. Thus, even though it had 58, the measure actually failed. But what's interesting is the vote by age on this ballot measure. Florida voters 18 to 29 supported the measure to legalize medical marijuana 79 to 21. But voters 65 and older rejected it 62-38. And because, again, they constituted a larger share of the electorate, the measure went down to defeat. In other words, lower voter turnout among young people is and was a decisive factor in the measure failing. But one does not need to look to Washington or to Atlanta to make a difference. One can do things right here at Georgia Southwestern. For instance, this month, student government will be taking applications for the Student Government Senate until Monday, April the 6th. There are 13 Senate seats. The top 13 candidates receiving votes are elected. Those who finish in 14th, 15th, and 16th place may qualify as an alternate senator. To qualify for candidacy, one only needs to be a GSW student with at least a 2.50 GPA, complete at least 12 semester hours of credit at GSW, be enrolled in at least 12 hours. Those who are currently in the Senate are eligible to run for the executive board. I encourage you to vote, but I challenge you to be a candidate. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Voice is extremely important to the democratic values that underlie government ethics. Voice is the way individuals and groups of individuals, including government employees and officials, let their dissatisfaction with government policies and misconduct be known. Voice is the principal secondary goal of government ethics. The primary goal is to maintain the public's trust in the government. But public trust is not important simply on its own. Public trust is important because without it, citizens give up voicing their concerns through participation in government, either informally through public comments, letters to the editor, blogs, and other social media, or formally through sitting on boards and commissions, running for office, or participating in campaigns and voting. Voice is an action where we express publicly our opinion and our concern about politics, social conditions, and economic issues, and how they affect us, and also how we would like to see them changed. Voice can be expressed in many different ways. Using the established channels, we can complain to our local council, we can vote for politicians, or we can influence decisions in local councils or committees. Sometimes to make a point, you've got to be loud. Ask anybody who's rallied behind a political candidate or a social cause, or who has sat in the role of a city manager or a CAO. I can attest to that. But sometimes being too loud can overshadow your point. Look at Representative Joe Wilson of South Carolina. He has fundamental disagreements with President Barack Obama on certain points on the healthcare debate, but is known less for his specific views than for being the guy who shouted, "You lie," at the president in the middle of his nationally televised speech. Representative Wilson was roundly criticized for his breach of protocol at the session of Congress, and he issued a public apology saying, I let my emotions get the best of me. This happens quite often when it comes to government. Think about meetings at your local city hall. And if you've never attended one of these meetings, then let me share my experiences with you. If there is a hot topic being discussed, public outbursts aren't unusual, and sometimes you'll even see your elected officials taking part. From Capitol Hill to your state capitol and to your city council, when the government acts, people get emotional. And why do people get emotional about government? Well, a major reason is because the government is spending your money. Its operations are paid for by tax dollars, and if the government is spending that money on something you are passionately opposed to, you might get upset. Almost everything you can think of gets taxed. Your paycheck, your mortgage, your parents' mortgage, even your cell phone bill. The government collects this money, your money, and uses it to work for you. Because the government does this, you have the right to participate in its meetings, to pay attention, and to scrutinize how officials spend the money you turn over to them. Generally, your local government officials meet regularly, sometimes weekly, sometimes several times a month. These meetings are usually advertised in the local newspaper beforehand. In the meetings, they discuss the work that they plan on doing that month, looking at each proposed job or issue one at a time, and then one by one, they vote on those proposals. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Sometimes these meetings are extremely dull. But they're important for you to be aware of and to participate in because they affect you directly and because it's your right to be involved. That being said, your voice may not always influence change because, unfortunately, those in power sometimes do not listen and do not want to change. There's no guarantee that the council or other local representative bodies will make decisions that reflect your concerns and ideas. People who represent women, poor people, or ethnic groups need to have speaking power and the capacity to counter attempts to silence them. They need to have skills to make their voice heard and responded to and reflected in decisions. By law, meetings are open and transparent because if citizens and the press are allowed to be present, it is much more difficult to silence people. It is very important that the formal rules and regulations are followed in the decision-making process in councils and committees. Generally speaking, these rules have been developed to ensure objective, inclusive, and democratic decisions, but often the problem exists where elected officials try to skip certain provisions or to go through them so quickly that people do not have time to react. This can result in decisions being unbiased and undemocratic. Governments have a duty to publish and promote openness. They cannot operate in secret. They have to debate issues and vote in public in the open. This was legislated by the federal government in amendments to the Freedom of Information Act in 1976, also referred to as the Sunshine Act. This spawned specific laws for each state known as Sunshine Laws. Basically, these laws created a greater openness in government operation and spelled out the rights for you, the public, to participate and have a say. By the Sunshine Laws, each meeting is required to have a public comment period. It may be at the beginning, middle, or the end of the meeting. Each state and local government has its own rules regarding how meetings are run and how you can participate. In the City of Americus, the mayor and council recently passed a significant change in how you can participate in meetings. First, you may only speak at a public meeting on items that are on the agenda for that meeting. Second, you must arrive early enough to sign up with the city clerk. You are given a total of 3 whole minutes to speak on any issue on that agenda for that meeting. And if you wish to address your mayor and council on issues or concerns that you may have that are not on that agenda, you must submit that request in writing to the CAO, and the CAO has 10 days to get that information to the mayor and council. 4 votes are required to allow you to speak if they allow it. It will take 4 votes. Having watched and listened to many concerned citizens address their elected officials in public meetings, I can offer these tips for you to help make the experience a little bit more meaningful. When it's your turn and time to talk, be calm. Take the microphone and speak forcefully but respectfully. Identify your issue early in your remarks and refer back to it at the end. Suggest a solution. It helps if you practice what you say before the meeting so your comment is short, powerful, and decisive. Keep your comments brief, especially since you only have 3 minutes here in Americas. But above all, be respectful. While less is certainly more when voicing your opinion, ideally you'll want to offer something more substantial and civil than "you lie." The opportunity to participate in public meeting is a great reminder of the special privileges we have as citizens in democracy. These venues allow you to listen and pose questions on issues that impact you to officials who represent you. We as Americans know that officials exercise the authority we grant them, and they are there to serve us. Responsible officials want and need to hear back from you on your concerns and your perceptions of their performance on your behalf. And the local level is where the voice and influence of the individual citizen is the strongest.
In 1920, a group of women fought and won the right to vote. As was already referenced, in 1965, a group of African Americans crossed a bridge in Selma, Alabama, and they brought attention to the continued violation of their constitutional rights. This led to the Voting Rights Act. In 1969, a group of LGBTQ citizens, they began to riot and protest against the brutality and harassment of the police against their marginalized community. This led to a turn from shame for that marginalized group, and today we celebrate it in something we call Pride Festivals. But folks, despite my highlighting these pivotal events that have moved us forward in history and toward greater equality, we do not live in a post-sexist, post-racist, or post-homophobic world. In fact, we live in a very sexist, racist, and homophobic society that is sustained by interlocking systems of oppression. Women still make 77 cents to the dollar of men, often for the same job and with the same credentials. 1 in 4 women will be sexually assaulted, and 70% of women will experience physical and/or sexual violence by an intimate partner. That's from the 2013 UN Women Report. According to the State of Working American study of 2013, Black median household family income is only 57.3% of white median family household income. And 1 in 9 Black men will be incarcerated. Hate murders of the queer community have increased by 11%, according to the National Coalition of Anti-Violence Programs. 87% of hate murders against that queer community are people of color. And those identifying as trans are 28% more likely to experience crimes of physical violence against them than those of normative gender. While our fight for marriage equality has been quite effective, 36 states now have legalized same-sex marriage. Woohoo! Okay. And I'm also quite confident that the Supreme Court is soon to rule on the right side of history and require that the rest of the states catch up, including Georgia. Having said that, though, only 17 states currently have laws protecting individuals from job discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. So you can get married today and legally lose your job for it tomorrow. And disturbingly, we are seeing a trend of some states attempting to create backlash laws that were similar to the laws that the southern states created in the 60s to try and keep people of color from voting. Only now the backlash laws are trying to continue discrimination against the homosexual community. I'm a mother of 1 boy, a spouse, a teacher, and an artist. I identify as a white, middle-class, cis woman that is bisexual in a same-sex committed marriage. I'm therefore a queer practicing homosexual, and I prefer the use of the pronoun she. My women's studies students understand all that. But today, I'm here to speak on behalf of all marginalized voices, not just my assigned groups. In my mind, it is vital that all marginalized voices join respectively together, thereby making our shout for equality louder. In the words of Audre Lorde, there is no hierarchy of oppression. And in the words of Martin Luther King, we know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Let us now collectively stand on the shoulders of the giants of the past, continuing the battles that they started. Folks like Sojourner Truth, Martin Luther King, and Harvey Milk. But this time, let us create change together as one movement of all marginalized voices, so that perhaps our voice is more readily heard. Although Audre Lorde wrote the book entitled Sister Outsider specifically on addressing feminist issues and women's issues, I would like to conclude by reading a section from this book. And as I do so, I ask that we each reflect on how those of us with an identity that causes our discrimination and oppression and marginalization can join together. Change means growth, and growth can be painful. But we sharpen self-definition by exposing the self in work and struggle together with those we define as different from ourselves, yet sharing the same goals. For Black and white, for young and old, for lesbian and heterosexual women alike, this can mean new paths to our survival. We have chosen each other and the edge of each other's battles. The war is the same. If we lose, someday women's blood will congeal upon a dead planet. But if we win, there's no telling. We seek beyond history for a new and more possible meeting. So let us then vote and protest. Let us write letters and poetry. Let us make noise and art. And let us make changes together. And most importantly, let us take action for and care for the plight of our fellow humans, whomever and wherever they are. Thank you.
Thanks to Dr. Como for inviting me to participate in this forum. Does my voice matter? Of course it does, for the simple reason that most people think it doesn't. Those people that do speak are the ones listened to in a democracy. Every issue, whether the issue is local, national, or global, has a group of stakeholders. People that care about the decisions that policymakers will take that will affect that issue. Enlightened people are concerned about the environment they live in, the physical environment, the political, social, cultural, and should do all they can to create an environment that allows them to pursue happiness, whatever that may mean for each individual. The unenlightened are more concerned with survival and dealing with the environment that they are confronted with. Fighting for survival precludes the ability to affect change. These are some of the people that remain silent because of their everyday burdens. The enlightened have the power to influence change. The unenlightened opt out. The purpose of university is to enlighten, to develop in you the tools to help shape the society you want to live in. When you decide not to be involved, not to have your voice heard, you are allowing others to shape the world you and your children and their children and their children will live in. There have been some important issues over the past 50 years in which even the disengaged, the apathetic, the unenlightened have been spurred to engage by eloquent voices of engagement. And some of these issues include the civil rights movement of the 1950s and the 1960s, the anti-Vietnam War movement of the 1960s and the 1970s, and the feminist and women's rights movements of the 1960s through the 1980s. All of these issues were so compelling that many of the silent and apathetic decided to speak up. Their voices united in outrage against injustice and military adventurism. And it worked. Groundswells work. Groundswells happen by the melding of voices into a crescendo that can't be ignored. Civil disobedience in the South, led by Dr. Martin Luther King and others, led to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which has been already referred to. Demonstrations and marches on college campuses and cities across the nation demonstrated to the Johnson and the Nixon administrations that the young were more and more convinced that the Vietnam War was illegitimate. The war ended because of these demonstrations, the collective cacophony of outraged voices. We recall May 4th of 1970. None of you are old enough to remember that. There are a few that do. But this is when the National Guard in Ohio shot and killed 4 Kent State University students. They were demonstrating against the war. I was so outraged then that I drove to a place called Brockport State University, which is part of the SUNY system, the State University of New York. My brother was a student there. And people were stunned, absolutely stunned that the American military turned their guns on American students and killed 4 students in cold blood. And, what do you do about that? What would you do about that? I think we've become much more apathetic as a society about things that should be important to us. What we did back 45 years ago was take over the university. And surprisingly enough, I was one of those voices that led the takeover. Because it was the only way that the administration at that university would listen to the voices of outrage. We were absolutely outraged. That was one of the turning points of the end of the Vietnam War, when Kent State students were killed. It took a couple more years, but the war essentially ended. It was lost domestically at Kent State. Civil disobedience in the South, led by Dr. Martin Luther King and others, led to the Voting Rights Act. I've already talked about that. Demonstrations and marches by a multi-generational mix of women and their supporters led to a woman's right to govern what happens to her own body. And I don't even need to talk about this, I don't think. If, evolutionary biology had changed and men could become pregnant, we wouldn't even be talking about abortion rights. It would be a non-issue. Roe versus Wade solved that problem in 1973. And we hope that we don't have to revisit that issue about what a woman can do and can't do with her body. Does your voice matter? Does your vote count? It is the enlightened that know individual voices build crescendos. Those voices begin to flutter the fabric of our social contract. If that contract becomes time-worn and in need of changing, forgive my metaphors here, but I kind of like them. When we speak, we add to the intensity of vibrations of that fabric. And when all of us speak, it begins to tear a fabric that we no longer are comfortable with. A new contract is formed if, in fact, that fabric, that social fabric tears. But what's important is after that social contract tears, participation is important. So once you've been successful in raising your voices and stopping a war or overthrowing a government, the Arab Spring of 2011, it didn't take too much to overthrow a bunch of governments in the Middle East. But the problem is building something up after you've torn it down. Participation after the contract dissolves is as important as its dissolution. The mending requires even more engagement. Tearing something apart is easy. Building something workable in its place requires many voices. Be one of those voices. Thanks.
Thank you to our panelists for their enlightening comments. We now will turn to the question and answer part of the event, the part that I feel brings this event life, your questions. So we have 2 mic stations. Please, if you have questions or comments, line up. And while we're waiting, I have a question I will address to the committee to give you a chance to line up. What do you do if no one else is doing anything about what you see needs to be changed? To any of you, or all of you. Oh, you need to turn this.
This is working. This is not, yeah, it is. Okay. You know, I think our society in 2015 is geared toward social change, social action, because we have social media. You know, back 45 years ago, we didn't have social media, except the telephone, which most people don't, you know, kind of one of these things that most people think of as social media. So political action, the ability of everybody's voice to be heard is much, much easier today than it ever has been. So, you know, as somebody who was involved years ago, it's sad that more people don't get involved in the issues that are affecting their lives. You should get involved. And it's much easier for you to get involved with all the technology that's available. Here we go.
Well, these mice are like Janet Jackson. I can tell you, having worked with the mayor and council here in Americas, it was absolutely astounding to watch how, when a group of individuals were finally made aware of some of the changes that the mayor and council were considering making, that for the first time in a very long time, budget meetings and council meetings where no one ever came before were all of a sudden showing up at the meetings and making their voices heard, and it influenced change. Probably not swallowed real well by the elected officials, because it was the first time they actually had folks paying attention. And but I can certainly say, firsthand experiences that I watched, things get passed through, or things that did not get passed through as a result of the community coming together and saying, we don't want this, or we do want this. So you can be quite influential when speaking.
Hello, my name is Kira Nguyen. I'm a marketing major, and social media was slightly brought up, but I was wondering, how do you weigh social media voice versus your physical voice in making change?
I think that it can go both ways, and it does go both ways. On the one hand, like Dr. Schmetro said, I think it's an easy way to be involved and to kind of take that role as an activist. I also think it can hinder activism, because all of a sudden you think just because you like or share some political post that means you're doing something. And I think you have to be more active than just simply sharing something on Facebook or tweeting it. What those things are, I think, take a lot more effort. So the tendency is to think, woohoo, I'm an activist, I just shared something controversial. You want to say?
I agree in terms of the limitations on there. I think too often people will just simply post a quick comment on social media and say, okay, well, I've taken a stand and I've made my position known to other people. But let's face it, in terms of, if we're talking about politics, you have to let the policymakers, the politicians, know your opinion. And they do. There have been several studies done, and looking in terms of how members of Congress or members of the legislature make decisions. And a lot of times they will tend to take a count as to how many votes, you might say how many phone calls they get, how many emails they get, how many contacts they get in their office, pro and con. So, in other words, if you're going to express yourself, it's also important to express yourself, if you will, to the people who can actually make those key and important decisions. If not, show up in person, right? Show up in person to these council meetings. Show up in person, like here at GSW. Show up in person to student government. You know, go see your state representative. He's often here on campus. In other words, that's what's kind of great about the United States, especially in your time. You going to college, you growing up, you getting involved, is that perhaps at no other time in American history has the process been as open and the ability for you to become as informed. Again, everybody up here remembers the day when we had 3 news networks, and if you can count PBS, 4. And usually you had to wait till, what, 6:30 maybe for half an hour to get national news. Today it's around the clock. There's like 3 C-SPANs, and I remember when it first came out. And you know, it was incredible to actually be able to see in terms of the functionings of the U.S. House Representatives. Now you can see in terms of the U.S. Senate. At least you can hear audibly in terms of the United States Supreme Court. So the process is much more open than it is now. So I would just simply say it's not enough just simply to express yourself, but also express yourself to the people who can make the decisions.
My name is Shelley Fry. I'm a nursing major. I have a question for Ms. Hughes. What is that book's name that you read from?
It is Sister Outsider by Audrey Lorde.
Sister Outsider? By who?
Audrey Lorde.
Audrey. Thank you.
Hello, yes. I'm Caleb Graves. I'm a psychology major. I'm sitting here trying to formulate my question, and it's a bit difficult, so bear with me. Growing up, I wasn't raised in an environment where politics was very relevant to us. Most of my family members didn't vote in all generations, so it wasn't there. So I don't really know much about the process or much about how to get informed or how to be involved. So I was wondering if you had any advice as to how to become involved, like the actual steps. You know, it's the theory of it is great, and I agree that it needs to happen, but the physical things that we should do or can do, the resources that we can use, the ways to become involved. I was just curious.
I can tell you locally, participating here, if you're a student here, and you're living here and want to participate in Americas, all the meetings of the mayor and council are advertised. They hold 3 meetings a month that you are open to come to. That is where you're hearing the decisions that they are making for the city. And you can get that information and decide if you like it, don't like it, but you're kept aware of it. Then if you choose to maybe address the council if you see they're wanting to move in a direction that you're not comfortable with. I'll give an example. Recycling became a big hot topic here. A hot mess too, to be just quite frank with you. And so a large group of the community who was just outraged at how they had handled recycling in the past got together and came to a meeting as a whole and just flooded the room. And I will tell you this, politicians are always looking towards the next election. And so when a group of people show up very angry or very passionate about a cause, that motivates change significantly. And I watched them go from one stance to a whole 180 to another stance, all because of the community's outspokenness about it. I too, like you, was not raised in an environment where I didn't attend a local city council meeting until I became the CAO. I mean, that just goes to show you that I too had no idea really how the process worked. But I can tell you that it is getting in their ear, the elected officials' ear, and at the local level, that's where you can make the most impact, because you have access to these people and they are elected to listen to the community. So I would recommend going to some of those meetings. Like I said, some of them are boring, but most of them are pretty entertaining too. There were many times where I sat with a bag of popcorn and could have laughed the whole night long watching them. But that would be my recommendation, locally at least.
I'll say a word real quick. As one of the advisors for the student government, we have meetings once a week, Thursday at 5 o'clock over in the Student Success Center. Talk about getting into politics at the grassroots level and concerned about your university. This is the way to do it. Senator Anthony Hand is over here. We've got our local politicians. Some might be in the crowd. You might have an editor for your local school newspaper over here in terms of the Southwestern. So there's organizations, there's groups here on campus. I was mentioning about elections that are coming up for student government. If you'd like to talk afterwards a little bit more about student government, I'd be happy to do that. But I invite everybody. Again, you want to start learning the process, learning basics, learning fundamentals of how a political system works. Why not get involved in the process closest to you? On Thursdays, yes, at 5 o'clock.
If you have a question, there's no waiting in lines 1 or 2. No waiting in lines 1 or 2. And question from 2.
Hello, my name is Bernard Foster. I'm an English major. And my question is, how do you put your voice into action? Like, for example, a local representative or a mayor, they could
hear your voice, but they can also choose not to do anything about it. So if that comes to the point, what can you do to put your voice into action?
At election time, you can make a lot of changes that would impact that. If you feel as though that you have a local representative or a mayor or a council member or whoever that serves this area, and they have chosen not to listen to the majority of the community and what the community wants, then put them out of office. You have the right to vote.
I'd like to add that I think sometimes we think our voice isn't getting heard or doesn't matter, and it sort of prevents us from trying. Write letters. I write the president often. And he responds, by the way. You get a letter back. Sometimes I think it's a form letter, but that's okay, I'm trying. So do simple things, and then the other thing I'd recommend is to figure out like-minded student groups and join in those, so that then, obviously numbers matter more than one person, so if you can tap into like-minded groups, that'll help as well.
My name is Matt Youngblood, and I am a business major. This is more or less a comment and a question, but I think given the fact that, as already been alluded to, you can attend your local city government meetings. You can post on social media. Not only are there more ways to make your voice heard, but I think your voice matters more than ever.
Would someone like to maybe respond to that? As far as your assessment of whether there's a difference in how much your voice matters today versus pre-social media?
I think it's important that, if you've got an issue, that you find like-minded people. Because a single voice is, kind of a voice in the wilderness. You need to find, and again, with the technology that's available to you, it's very easy to find like-minded people, whether it's recycling in Americus, Georgia, or doing something about, I personally was outraged in 2003 when the United States invaded Iraq. And there was nothing coming from campuses all over the country back 12 years ago. I think probably because there was no draft back there's still no draft. And back when, the Vietnam War was going on, there was in fact a draft. So every male on campus all over the country had skin in the game, as it were. They were kind of worried about getting drafted and going overseas and possibly losing their lives. Whereas, we send people overseas and we kind of forget about them. They come back, we call them heroes, and then we go on with our lives. It's important that voices are aggregated. You can't simply post something and think that you've done something or expect that somebody will react to that. Expect something concrete will arise from that. And again, you need to find like-minded people, and it's very easy to do that.
We have a question in the back.
Would you please, panelists, explain the difference between voting in your hometown and absentee ballot, and how does one register to vote? Because I think we have a lot of folks who are not registered to vote.
A lot of different ways, and that's one of the, I guess, beauties and curses of the American political system. In terms of the process, it depends where you are. One way in which you can do this is to acquire like a ballot online from the Secretary of State office of Georgia. We also have the Supervisor of Elections in Sumter County at the county courthouse. I have some voter registration forms in my office in the History and Political Science building in room 321. One of the things to note, talking about local government, we do have, for instance, an election coming up on March 17th. Early voting is currently underway. We have a referendum dealing with the extension of a sales tax to consider whether or not to refurbish and to build a new high school here in Sumter County. So we've got, and when you think about terms of matters dealing with like a referendum, that's a policy question, a yes or no, where you decide the tax, you decide the tax rate. You decide whether or not there's going to be a new high school in Sumter County. In other words, you don't have to just simply elect somebody else to make decisions for you. There are opportunities in which you can decide policy matters as well. But like I said, there's a number of ways you can do that. Like I said, in person. There's the courthouse. There's online in which you can acquire ballots. But it is critical, and one of the things you always want to look at to make your voice heard is that in most states in our union, except for one, we do require voter registration. The other thing is trying to find out when elections are going to be held, and usually you have to register so many weeks in advance. I believe in Georgia it's around 30 days or so. Mm-hmm. If not, then you're eligible for the next election. Absentee balloting, there's a process also for that where you can get a ballot mailed to you. Early voting is simply where you have designated periods prior to election day itself. I believe it's like 8 to 5, the county courthouse, Monday through Friday, in which you can kind of cast your vote prior to election day. So there's different aspects to it, but it does require a little bit of work on your part to find out in terms of when and where to register to vote and when precisely one is eligible. It's one thing to say about the Constitution that you have the right to vote, but it's also to be able to educate yourself enough or to ask those who do know how to actually participate and put your vote to work.
I'm Laurel Robinson. I'm the chair of the Visual Arts Department. So a couple of you sort of mentioned that you get together with like-minded people. And I think that part of the problem that I'm seeing in the world of polarization is that too many like-minded people are getting together and not talking to other people who are like-minded about something else. So it seems that if our voices need to address complex subjects, just staying polarized with like-minded people is problematic. So I was wondering if anybody on the panel had ideas for how to blend or learn to listen to each other in non-like-minded positions. Thank you.
No. Well.
We have this really cool thing called Panorama.
No, I mean, I agree. I do think that is perhaps one of the most serious political issues that we have right now, and it's really one of those things that's incumbent on all of us to get involved, and instead of allowing kind of a few strident voices to dominate the conversation. It requires those of us who are more practical, those who understand that the essence of democracy is compromise, not always getting exactly what you want, realizing that your political opponent is not your enemy, that we're actually ultimately all on the same side, striving for solutions to make our country, our states, our county, our school better. And I think it's important to exercise even some of our multiple interests, joining more than just one club. And I would imagine by joining more than one organization, we're going to encounter some of those who we would not necessarily, maybe at first blush, think of them as a political ally, but maybe we might actually find them something in common. Joining religious organizations, joining athletic clubs, joining, like a student government, maybe some kind of environmental program. You're likely to encounter more and different people. So I think exercising on the full range of your interests, I think, does help.
Hello, okay. My name is Brendan Foster, English major again. And you mentioned earlier that ages 18 through 29 has the lowest and most inconsistent voting age in the United States. Do you think it's that they don't know about the election process, or they don't really trust their representative, or can you go more in depth about it? And as you can, give them ways on how they can be more informed about election and voting and everything.
Excellent question. In terms of citing some of those statistics, I mean, that's one aspect of looking at, different age cohorts and kind of their rate of turnout and participation. But also, if you look within a particular age cohort, such as the 18 to 29-year-olds, one of the things one does find is that, for instance, women are more likely to participate than men. One also finds, for instance, here recently that whites and African Americans are more likely to participate than Asians and Hispanics and or Latinos. If we're looking within the African American community, black women are more likely, about 10 percentage points among the 18-29 are more likely to vote than black men. So there's different components and different aspects, you might say, that one would want to address. I think one of the largest gaps, however, is between those who've received a college education, who are in this 18 to 29, or who are attending or who are going to school, than those who aren't. And I think that's perhaps, if we're just focusing on the youth voters in the United States, the youth electorate is trying to reach out those who are not in a university, who are not seeking a college education, and trying to close that gap, I think, is crucial.
Good afternoon. I'm Linda Randall, the first-year advocate and director of the Academic Resource Center. I am one of the few people in the room that was around at the point where Kent State happened. I was 15 years old at that time, and I actually did a report on Kent State, the massacre at Kent State in 9th grade. So I've been pretty politically active for a real long time. What I'd like you to address is helping us understand, in these times with so much money in politics and so many people seeming to buy the vote, why our vote still matters. Thanks.
Money is also one of these key problems within the United States, and I'd say at least at one level, so long as the United States Supreme Court sees money as speech, you're going to continue to have large amounts of money involved in our campaigns. However, despite the fact that money might receive a lot of attention in our politics, I would just simply say that there's always the hope. Numbers, that is, the numbers of voters, typically trump money. In other words, money does not dictate an outcome. Money might actually follow support. And I'll just give you just one quick illustration of this that I was talking about in my senior seminar. As an example of this, you had this past election cycle, the number 2 person in the Republican House leadership, Eric Cantor in Virginia. He had raised about $5.5 million. His opponent had only raised about $200,000. In other words, basically he was being outspent around 25 to 1 or so. However, in terms of the Republican primary, the second strongest Republican, despite the endorsements, despite the various interests that were behind him, he went down to defeat to some unknown college professor. Yes, it is possible, right? The college professors can also get involved and make a difference even without the money. So in other words, money is not always, you might say, kind of the indicator that causes one's defeat and or election. However, I think it does remain a problem, but there is hope that as long as you get out and vote, if you participate at higher rates, as I said, especially if young people can participate in rates that older Americans or those who have higher income, that's probably the solution, right? Higher income Americans do vote, typically around 70% voter turnout. So if you're young, if you're modest means, if you're a minority, get out and vote. Vote in higher rates. Numbers can triumph and prevail over those who might have income.
I'd also like to kind of bring up that your money can count too. So, like for example, you guys know the Chick-fil-A issue? Who's familiar? Nobody? Wow. Okay, so like we have Chick-fil-A on our campus, and I particularly am boycotting that. I don't give them my dollars. I do not buy chicken sandwiches. And it's not because I don't like it. It's because they give $3.6 million in 2011. They gave that much to anti-gay and hate groups, people that were lobbying for anti-gay laws and to push back against the marriage equality stuff. So it may not seem like a lot that I'm not buying chicken sandwiches anymore, but it's helping. So in 2012, all those kiss-ins that people were doing, going in and protesting by same-sex couples kissing in Chick-fil-A, and also by the boycotts, all of the queer community and our allies refusing to give them our business anymore, they now have reduced it down to only one hate group that they're still funding. But hey, it's getting sort of. So they're only doing one, so I'm still not buying chicken. But they have greatly reduced their funding of different groups. So it's helping a little, just like even just refusing to buy or to give your dollar to those things, then helps reduce the funding that legislation ends up having.
And I think you're right in saying that money influences elections, but it influences elections by purchasing media time and allowing a lot more outreach by candidates who are well-funded. And the way to counteract that is simply to become informed, not to be fooled by cascades of advertisements on TV. If you know the truth, if you're informed about issues, then all that advertisement that money is buying won't influence your vote. Your vote will be influenced by the truth, and of course, the way you perceive it. The Supreme Court a few years ago said that corporations are people too, and they have a right to donate to campaigns, but you can counteract all that corporate finance by becoming more and more informed about the issues. That's your pushback.
This is Matt Youngblood again, business major. I think one of the reasons that our young do not vote is, and this goes for more than just the young, but I think a lot of people are not informed about enough. I mean, whether it's the candidates or the issues that face the election. So my question is, what can we do to inform people in general? Because it's not just the young. But what can we do to inform people about the issues and the candidates?
Well, we can't put all our faith in Fox News, or CNN, or MSNBC. What you have to do, your responsibility as an individual in a democracy, is to read as much as you possibly can. All of our time is limited. We have constraints. You try to find media that provide you the truth, and I can suggest some periodicals that provide a great deal of information. But that's what you do, is you become informed, and an informed populace, an informed electorate is the heart of democracy. It's very difficult to Shanghai an informed electorate.
Any questions left before we close the event? Going once, going twice, last time to make your voice heard? Okay, the time has come to end today's discussion. I would like to thank everyone who contributed to this event. Thank you to the members of the panel for volunteering their time and expertise. Let's give them a round of applause. I'd like to thank the members of the Panorama Planning Committee. Raise your hand if you're on the committee and you're here. So there are a number of people who've worked diligently to help make this happen. I'd like to thank Bob Slanker and the folks from the information from the Instructional Technology Department for allowing this to be recorded, and they're going to put it on YouTube so you can go back and revisit the event. I would also like to thank all the faculty, staff, administrators who supported Panorama. I would also like to take a moment to give a special thanks to Dr. Helen Tate, who I don't believe is here right now. Dr. Tate put a tremendous amount of effort and energy into our first Panorama event, and in doing so, she laid the foundation for today's event as well as future Panorama panel events. I'd like to thank her for all the work she did. Most importantly, I'd like to thank you for being here and for being part of the conversation. This is not an event if you aren't here and if you aren't here to ask questions. So you're why we're doing this. Please, if you have any suggestions for topics, you can email me, joseph.camo@gsw.edu, or you can tweet us at panorama_GSW with your ideas for topics. So be safe, and we'll see you at the next Panorama. Thank you.